Nigeria, Reborn, the Curriculum of Liberation, Part 1. Broken Foundation. Unmasking the historical, ideological, and structural flaws in Nigeria's educational inheritance. Chapter 1. The Colonial Classroom, designed for dependence. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. African proverb. I was 10 years old when I was first taught that my ancestors were primitive. The teacher wore a white shirt, his chalk-dusted fingers scratching words like civilization, exploration, and missionary onto a blackboard that sat like a border between two worlds. I sat there, sandwiched between a boy who barely had lunch and a girl whose eyes held more fire than fear. We all nodded obediently, repeating back words we didn't fully understand. Words that quietly, insidiously, made us doubt our blood. That day, something broke. But I wouldn't know it until years later, sitting across from an elder in Ogbomosho who said to me, "The white man built schools not to make us free, but to make us useful." He was right. The invention of the native elite. When the British set foot on Nigerian soil, they didn't just bring guns, flags, and churches. They brought blackboards, desks, and a blueprint for control. The goal was not to educate, but to condition. Colonial education was a tool of social engineering. It created what the British called the native elite. Interpreters, clerks, and court messengers who could help run the empire but never challenge it. They taught us to read, but not to ask. They taught us to write, but not to rewrite. They taught us to memorize, but not to remember who we were. This was by design. The curriculum was built to produce compliance, not creativity. It praised distant lands while mocking local wisdom. It taught Shakespeare, but ignored Chinua's ancestors. It framed our own past as something to escape, not something to refine. Learning to forget ourselves. At the heart of colonial education was an unspoken mission: cultural amnesia. Students were taught that progress meant becoming less Nigerian, more English. In Lagos, children were punished for speaking Yoruba in class. In Enugu, Igbo language was relegated to the playground. Even the names we bore were often erased. Chinonso became Charles. Oluwadamilola became Damien. Our languages, names, stories, songs, all were trimmed away to make room for Queen's English and the King James Bible. And what was lost in that process? Dignity, direction, self-definition. We became strangers in our own land, navigating an education system that treated our cultures as backward, our histories as incomplete, and our aspirations as dangerous. The factory model of learning. The British were not training revolutionaries, they were building bureaucrats. The system mirrored the industrial model: rows of students, rigid routines, rote memorization. Critical thinking was discouraged. Practical skills were scorned. Farming was seen as menial, craft as crude, storytelling as superstitious. This model persisted after independence. Nigeria changed flags, but not philosophy. We inherited not just their institutions, but their intentions. And so the classrooms stayed the same: cold, hierarchical, and utterly divorced from our people's real needs. As the elder told me, they trained us to carry briefcases, but not to build anything with our hands. The legacy of miseducation today, the effects are painfully obvious. A glut of graduates, but a drought of innovators. A deep hunger for Western validation, but a suspicion of local brilliance. An education system that teaches students how to pass exams, but not how to change their communities. We've been taught to romanticize white-collar jobs while scorning the soil beneath our feet. We've built a nation of job seekers, not job creators. Our universities are filled with youth who can recite Keynesian theory, but cannot explain how a yam grows. Who can quote Aristotle, but have never read a Lauda Equiano or listened to the philosophies embedded in Moonlight folktales. This is not just a crisis of curriculum. It is a crisis of identity. Curriculum snapshot. Then versus now. Colonial curriculum, liberation curriculum. Proposed. History of Britain. History of Nigeria and Africa, European literature. Only African and global literature. Christian religious instruction only. Comparative religion plus indigenous ethics, rote memorization. Inquiry-based, critical thinking. Civics as obedience. Civics as agency and leadership. English as superior, multilingual mastery. Local plus global. Reclaiming the classroom as a sacred space. It's time to remember, education is not neutral. It either liberates or it indoctrinates. What if we transformed every classroom into a space of cultural dignity, political consciousness, and entrepreneurial spirit? What if, instead of teaching our children to escape their roots, we taught them to grow from them? Imagine a curriculum where a TIV child learns the agricultural cycles of their ancestors alongside sustainable farming techniques. Where an Igbo girl reads Chinua Achebe and learns coding in the same week. Where Yoruba proverbs become portals into philosophy, morality, and systems thinking. That is not nostalgia. That is nation building. Voices from the field. When I finally learned about the history of the Benin Kingdom, I cried. Why did no one tell us we came from such brilliance? Uche, university student, Edo State. I teach physics in Hausa. My students understand faster. They connect it to their daily life. I don't care what the ministry says. Fatima Ibrahim, secondary school teacher, Katsina. We don't just need to rewrite the syllabus. We need to ask, who are we educating for? Dr. Kunli Adesina, curriculum specialist, reflection and action. What ideas about success have you internalized that come from colonial frameworks? How can you help the young people around you reconnect with their identity through learning? Are there elders in your family or community whose knowledge should be part of the curriculum? The movement begins. This is not about erasing the past. It is about editing the inheritance. It is about daring to dream of a Nigeria where our education system produces thinkers, makers, and healers. A Nigeria where our children learn not just how to earn a living, but how to live with purpose, pride, and peace. The colonial classroom was designed for dependence. The liberated classroom will be designed for destiny. Let us begin again, with our stories intact, our heads held high, and our hearts wide open. Chapter 2. Curriculum of Compliance, the silent curriculum that cripples a nation. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Steve Biko, the silent curriculum. Not every lesson is written on the blackboard. Some are embedded between the lines, invisible but deeply felt. Like the unspoken rule that the teacher is always right, even when they are wrong. Or that the goal of education is not to question, but to conform. This is the curriculum of compliance. A psychological blueprint that teaches children how to follow orders, not how to chart new paths. It is silent, it is subtle, and it is powerful. The tragedy is that most of us survived it. Some of us even excelled in it. But we rarely stop to ask, what did it cost us? Obedience over curiosity, a system that rewards silence. Walk into any school in Nigeria and you will notice the same pattern. Students recite answers, not ask questions. Teachers hold authority like a badge of divinity. And woe betide the child who dares to challenge a rule, an instruction, or, God forbid, a marking scheme. From primary 1 to university, obedience is drilled, tested, and rewarded. The quiet child gets praised. The questioning child gets punished. The creative child gets corrected. We have created generations of minds trained to seek approval over truth, applause over purpose, and perfection over progress. This isn't education, it's programming. The psychology of the controlled mind. Psychologists call this learned compliance, a survival strategy where the child adapts to authority not out of respect, but out of fear. Over time, this seeps into the subconscious. Fear of being wrong becomes fear of speaking. Desire to please becomes inability to disagree. Reward for repetition becomes rejection of originality. The result? Adults who don't question laws, don't innovate businesses, and don't hold leaders accountable. A citizenry that accepts dysfunction as destiny because they were never taught to challenge the system. As Dr. Ifeoma Iroanya, an educational psychologist in Enugu, told me, our students grow up brilliant, but afraid. Afraid to fail. Afraid to lead. Afraid to think differently. Real stories, real consequences. Take the case of Sei, a brilliant 16-year-old in Ibadan who loved to take radios apart and rebuild them with upgrades. His teacher told him to stop wasting time on nonsense and focus on his WAEC exam prep. He passed the exam. He never touched a circuit again. Or Titi, a literature student in Lagos, who challenged the meaning of a poem during a class discussion. Her teacher replied, "Stick to what the exam board wants." That day, her imagination dimmed. She never wrote another poem. These are not isolated cases. These are echoes of a system designed to suppress initiative in favour of standardization. We worship structure at the expense of spirit, a colonial inheritance. The curriculum of compliance didn't start with us, it was inherited. Colonial rulers knew that the easiest way to govern millions was not with guns, but with grooming. So they created a school system where loyalty trumped logic and passivity was power. Obedience-based learning was a tool of empire, passed down like old furniture, still dusty with the fingerprints of oppression. And even now, in post-colonial Nigeria, we keep polishing that same furniture. We've changed the flag, but not the pedagogy. How the curriculum of compliance blocks development. 1. Stifled innovation. In a world driven by innovation, our students are still being taught to copy notes instead of create knowledge. The next Zuckerberg might be in a classroom right now, being told to stop asking questions. 2. Weak leadership culture, a society that rewards obedience breeds followers, not visionaries. We wonder why we have political leaders who don't inspire. Perhaps it's because we never trained them to question or think independently. 3. Low civic engagement. Citizens who are educated to obey don't protest. They don't ask for change. They endure. And that endurance becomes the soil in which corruption grows. Curriculum snapshot. Compliance versus confidence. Compliance model. Confidence model. Teacher as authority. Teacher as facilitator. Memorization of facts. Application of ideas. Punishment for mistakes. Learning through failure. Rigid answers. Open-ended exploration. Fear-based discipline. Trust-based dialogue. Restoring the spirit of inquiry. Education must be more than a performance. It must be a provocation, a space where students are dared to think, feel, and imagine freely. A system that teaches children to challenge injustice, question tradition, and reimagine what is possible. Instead of, repeat after me, we must begin to say, what do you think? Instead of, stay within the lines, we must say, draw new ones. Voices of rebellion. When I let my students build their own science projects, the school authorities said I was wasting time. But the students smiled in a way I had never seen before. Blessing Isi, science teacher, Enugu. I grew up thinking questioning my elders was disrespectful. Now I'm learning that questioning is how we grow. Ifeanyi, university student, in soccer, reflection and action. When was the last time you challenged a rule you disagreed with? What would your education have looked like if your curiosity had been celebrated instead of silenced? How can we raise children who are respectful but not robotic? The revolution of the question. This chapter isn't just about the past, it's about the future. About building a Nigeria where the classroom is not a cage, but a canvas. Where our children are taught not what to think, but how to think. Let us rebuild our education system not as a compliance machine, but as a confidence incubator. A place where courage is taught alongside calculus, and questions are not feared, but fed. Because a nation that does not question its teachers will one day be too afraid to question its leaders. And that, my dear reader, is how freedom dies quietly, in a silent classroom. Chapter 3. Erased Voices. How Indigenous knowledge systems were excluded and why. Every time an elder dies, a library burns to the ground. African proverb, the unseen erasure. In a village in Zamfara, an old man bends over a bowl of herbs, whispering incantations in Hausa as he stirs crushed bark and black seeds. In Calabar, a woman hums a rhythm that has been used for generations to ease childbirth. In the Niger Delta, a fisherman traces his route through the water using the stars, the tides, and the stories passed down from his grandfather. None of these people have degrees. None of their knowledge is published in journals. And yet, they hold wisdom forged from centuries of survival, harmony, and mastery of place. But where are their voices in our classrooms? Gone. Erased. Not by accident, but by design. Colonialism and the devaluation of local genius. The colonizers did not just conquer land, they conquered truth. They brought with them not only guns and laws, but epistemologies, systems of knowing and naming the world. To rule the body, they had to first discredit the soul. And so, they declared African knowledge primitive, superstitious, unscientific. Our herbalists became witch doctors. Our astrologers became pagans. Our moral philosophies became oral traditions, not worthy of textbooks. Western science, Western medicine, Western logic, all elevated to the realm of universal truth. Meanwhile, African indigenous knowledge was confined to the shadows of the uncivilized. This was not just cultural arrogance. It was intellectual apartheid, the mechanism of erasure. 1. Language exclusion. Indigenous knowledge is carried in indigenous languages: Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Tiv, Kanuri, Efik, and hundreds more. When colonial education prioritized English as the language of intelligence, it automatically silenced every elder, every proverb, every metaphor not spoken in the colonizer's tongue. 2. Text. Over oral tradition. Western academia worships the written word. If it's not in a textbook, it doesn't exist. African knowledge, rooted in stories, songs, ceremonies, and observation, was seen as unreliable because it wasn't bound between covers. 3. Christian morality as filter knowledge tied to traditional religion, Ifa, Afa, Dibia, or ancestral worship, was deemed demonic. Anything sacred outside the church was either condemned or forgotten. Our spiritual cosmologies were painted as dangerous rather than profound. 4. Curriculum gatekeeping. The national curriculum still treats Western science as real science. Nigerian students learn Newton and Galileo, but not the astronomical systems of the Dogon people or the environmental engineering of Yoruba town planning. Case study: the Ifa Corpus Ifa, the Yoruba system of divination, is a complex body of oral knowledge covering ethics, medicine, ecology, astronomy, and psychology. It's arguably one of the most sophisticated information systems in Africa, predating modern databases with its structured mnemonic codes. But in Nigerian schools, Ifa is rarely taught, except as a cautionary tale in religious studies. What would it look like if we treated Ifa not as folklore, but as philosophy? If we unpacked the Odu verses in classrooms as intellectual frameworks? If we studied the decision-making algorithms of Babalawos alongside lessons on artificial intelligence? That kind of curriculum terrifies those invested in colonial continuity. The cost of forgetting. We did not just lose content, we lost confidence. By erasing Indigenous knowledge, we raised generations who believed their ancestors were ignorant, their culture backward, their wisdom irrelevant. This led to dependency on foreign models. From health to housing, we seek imported solutions to problems that local knowledge had already solved, sometimes better. Cultural shame. Young Nigerians today often mock their mother tongues, avoid traditional clothes, and know more about European philosophers than African kings. Disconnection from land. Indigenous knowledge is relational. It teaches respect for nature, rhythm, and reciprocity. Without it, we've become strangers in our own environment. Curriculum snapshot. Reintegrating Indigenous knowledge. Erased. Subject reclaiming framework. Yoruba Ifa, divination, ethical decision-making, plus oral logic systems, Igbo and Bari. Hausa's art, architecture, and community aesthetics. Hausa Griot, storytelling history, plus leadership through narrative memory. Tiv, agricultural calendar, environmental science rooted in observation. Traditional midwifery practices. Integrative healthcare with cultural empathy, real voices. Real wisdom. I can tell the health of the soil by how the ants move. But no one asks me. They bring white men with machines. Baba Musa, Farmer, Kwara. The Ifa versus Hold lessons on governance, strategy, and morality. But in school, they only taught us Plato. Adedayo, philosophy graduate, Lagos. I stopped telling my stories in class because my teacher said, "We're not here for tales." But that was my truth. Kioma, secondary school student, Anambra. Reflection and action. What Indigenous knowledge exists in your family that has never been written down? What would it mean to treat our elders as professors, our culture as curriculum? How might our education system change if every child was taught to respect their roots before reaching for the world? The return of the ancestors. This chapter is a call, not to nostalgia, but to reintegration. Our future does not lie in choosing between the past and the present. It lies in weaving them together. We must re-indigenize our education, not to reject science, but to expand it. Not to shun innovation, but to ground it. Let the Babalawo sit beside the engineer. Let the griot speak after the economist. Let the herbalist walk the same halls as the biochemist. Because no nation can develop when it forgets the very knowledge that sustained its people for millennia. The ancestors are waiting, not to be worshipped, but to be heard again. Let the erased voices speak.